Well, welcome. My name is Carolin Emcke. I'm quite happy to welcome you here to the Schaubühne and all of you who join us via the live stream to today's Streitraum on the topic Radical Universalism. Can the idea of enlightenment still be saved? The liberal democracy is in crisis. The weaknesses of a liberalism that only knows how to respond to inequality and exclusion with the concept of individual rights are too obvious. How can a universal humanism be conceived that is not too abstract and not too concrete? How can the principle of justice be grounded, and how does it relate to political majority decisions? In his latest book, Radical Universalism, Omri Boehm asks the big questions about democracy and truth, identity and justice, and urges unexpected answers. So I'm quite happy that he's here today. I would like to introduce him. Omri Boehm was born in Haifa in 1979. He's associate professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department at the New School for Social Research in New York. He is an Israeli and German citizen and has conducted research in Munich and Berlin, among other places. His book, Kant's Critique of Spinoza, was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and he writes about Israel, politics, culture, and philosophy in Haaretz, Die Zeit, and the New York Times, among other publications. His critically acclaimed books, Israel, a Utopia, and Radical Universalism, the book that we are going to talk about today, were published by Populaire. Welcome, Omri Boehm. And to my right, Martin Saar. He was born in 1970 in Tübingen. He's a professor of social philosophy at the Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main and currently a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, Science College in Berlin. He studied philosophy, psychology, and economics at the Free University in Berlin and in New York, and has taught in Bremen, Hamburg, Berlin, and Leipzig. In Frankfurt, he is a member of the faculty of the Institute for Social Research and the Research Center Normative Orders. His work focuses on the history of political ideas of the early modern period, critical theory, and recent French philosophy, as well as on questions of power, history, democracy, and subjectivity. Welcome, Martin Saar. First, I would like to say a few words on our agenda today. First, Omri Boehm will give a keynote for 30 minutes approximately on the topics of his book. Omri Boehm will talk in English. We have a simultaneous translation, and I would cordially thank our two interpreters, Astrid Giese and Patricia Isomo, at this point. And for those of you who have these small receivers, Channel 1 is the German translation, and Channel 2 is the English translation. And those of you who are joined via the stream, there should also be the offer, on the one hand, to listen to the discussion in German, or on the other in English. After Omri Boehm, we will talk with each other on this stage. We might have about an hour or maybe a little bit longer to do so. Then the stream will end, but the audience here in this room has the opportunity to ask questions or to comment, but please wait until you get the microphone, because otherwise we cannot have a interpretation. So please be patient, but everyone will get a chance. So first, Omri Boehm.
Thanks very much. It is a pleasure to be here with people that I personally admire and also consider friends. I'll read 30 minutes and then we'll go into the discussion, as Carolin mentioned. I'd like to begin maybe by reading the following proposition. I think everybody in the crowd will know it. And I wonder how many people in the crowd, I cannot really see you, but how many people in the crowd would raise their hands to support it? We hold this truth to be self-evident. that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Since this is a big room, maybe I can put my colleagues on stage on the spot and ask, would you support those statements publicly, or would you deny them publicly, or refuse to raise your hand to support them publicly?
Shall we answer? I would not.
Good. Me neither. Okay, good. We'll have to discuss.
Can we stay on stage, or?
That's for you to decide. We will discuss. 15 years ago, when I started teaching philosophy, I used to open my Kant seminars by reading these statements for the declaration to my students and asking them to raise a hand if they support it. The results were always the same. Everyone raised their hands immediately, not to say automatically. There was a feeling almost of dogmatism in the air. None of the students allowed themselves to entertain any doubts about the self-evident truths asserted in 1776 by the American founding fathers. But of course, this was just a pedagogical setup. Once the class so unanimously committed itself to Enlightenment, universalism, to humanism, it was immediately challenged with the question of its origin or its ground. The same question, and this is often overlooked, the same question that haunted Kant in the very same years in which the Declaration of Independence was formulated. That is, if you support universalism, if you support universalist humanism, why? What grounds the authority of the truth asserted in the Declaration of Independence, to say nothing about its self-evidence? Is it science? Is it faith? And if you cannot answer that question, is your conviction that all humans are created equal any better than blind dogmatic religion? I want to say that it is not easy to provide these questions with a straightforward answer. That's why it made sense to perplex my students with this self-evident truth before teaching Kant, who arguably attempted to answer them. 15 years after, we're sitting here in this room, I still read those statements to my students, but in the meantime, no one raises a hand, also not my colleagues. There's a feeling, but this is now not the implication about this room, there's a feeling of a new conformism in the air. It's the conviction that Enlightenment universalism ought to be rejected. My students object that America's founding fathers were slaveholders, that Kant himself, of course, was a racist, a favorite topic also in the German feuilletons. My students claim that all men are created equal means literally men and exclusively white. In short, that Enlightenment universalism isn't the guardian of human rights, but just the opposite. At best, it's a hypocritical ideology that tolerates white supremacy. At worst, it's a supremacist tool used by the white West to colonize, to occupy, to expropriate, and enslave. Now, since it is possible that the challenge that I'm trying to import from 1776 America is too far-fetched from this room in order to be genuinely perplexing, consider the following sentence, also familiar. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Sie zu achten und zu schützen ist Verpflichtung aller staatlichen Gewalt. How many people here endorse it? Okay, so we'll have to discuss. We will disagree about the next proposition. I want to say that this is just the same endorsement of Enlightenment universalism, and we'll obviously have to discuss what then is the difference between those two statements. In any case, I would argue that this is...
Ich habe die Befürchtung, dass das hier so eine leichte Prüfungssituation werden könnte.
Yes.
Okay.
Zumindest der Verfassungsschutz ist jetzt beruhigt. Sagt, ja. Of course, there can be differences, and we will talk about them, between the Declaration of Independence and Article 1 of German Grundgesetz. But I would argue that it is just an assertion of Enlightenment universalism. For our purposes, in any case, we will discuss, obviously, now the distinctions. That is, human dignity, the concept of human dignity, is inviolable and, in that sense, unalienable. All authority of law is relative to it. The worth or dignity of humanity is, in this sense, absolute. It is self-evident and universal. And the relation between absolute, self-evident, and universal can be debated between philosophers. I see Martin already shaking his head, and we can discuss. That is, at least in my reading, the first article of German basic law is a straightforward assertion of Kantian universalism. And to the extent that this is true, a couple of questions come up. First, is this basic law, tied as it is, if it is, to Enlightenment universalism, even specifically to Kant's version of it, akin, if it is, to the Declaration of Independence, actually an assertion or an expression of the White West's racism and colonialism? Should we defend that principle, or should we decolonize it? Second, if, after all, you do support such universalism, and the question would apply here to Martin and Carolin, if we can still stand by such universalism, then why? What is the ground or the authority of this law? Be that as it may, the most important aspect of the Declaration of Independence and of the first article of German Grundgesetz, in my view, is not what they appeal to, but in a way, what they do not appeal to. That's the most important aspect. They do not appeal to we, the people, neither the American people nor the German. Rather, they appeal to the authority of a truth about humanity as opposed to national sovereignty as a foundation of law. That is, they posit an authority that's higher than positivist man-made law, the type that is based on the will of, say, a king, or even on democratic consensus. They stand above any will, including the people's. That's also the reason why the Declaration of Independence and Grundgesetz 1 are, in my view, abolitionist texts. They immediately entail the right of revolution, even often or sometimes the duty to disobey, once the law itself becomes a weapon that attacks human dignity rather than defends it. In the Declaration of Independence, which may well be the origin of the word abolitionism, or the term abolitionism, this is fully explicit. The Declaration derives from the self-evident truth that all humans are equal, the right, and this is now a quote, the right, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of equality, to abolish it. It's important for me that the term abolish is in the quote. So the notion of abolitionism is coming from the Declaration of Independence. For the abolitionists in America, it did come from the Declaration of Independence. That's significant. That is, the right of revolution and the very idea of abolitionist democracy follows philosophically and historically from the assertion of universal truth. It is an irony, I think, a tragedy, that progressives nowadays want very much to defend abolitionist democracy. We can speak more about what that means. In any case, I'm in favor of such politics. But they want to do so by unlearning the allegedly supremacist universalism of Enlightenment rather than by finally learning it. Take, for example, the abolitionist John Brown. In 1859, Brown took over a military arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and tried to steal its 100,000 rifles in order to distribute them all throughout the South to slaves, to start a war of emancipation. That was the last rehearsal before the American Civil War, which broke out 2 years after. John Brown was the first person, this is interesting, an interesting historical detail, the first person in American history to be executed for treason, and in some sense, rightly so, because he was consciously acting to undermine the American Constitution, which defended the rights of the people to the property, not the human rights of enslaved black men and women who were that property. Essentially, that's what abolitionism is about, preferring the absolute authority of universalism, as asserted in the Declaration of Independence, over any law or authority, including the Constitution. That's a big debate between abolitionists and unionists, for those who remember their classes on American history. Insofar as law is based on national sovereignty rather than human dignity, it can be suspended. If today we ask to defend abolitionism in any form, I personally don't know that there is any way to do so but defending the authority of universalism, which reintroduces the question that I asked a moment ago. If we accept universalism, why? What can ground it? Can it be taken seriously at all? Now, according to the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, as just an example of how a way of doing that, our rights as humans were given to us by our Creator. Earlier in the text, the Founding Fathers appeal also to the station given to us by nature's God, to the place we have in creation. But from the perspective of contemporary political thinking, grounding universalism in God is, of course, completely futile. The most familiar modern alternative to defend rights has been to replace God by nature. In this sense, replace religion by science, which studies nature. On this view, human beings have inalienable natural rights or inviolable natural dignity. By nature, humans have a right to their bodies. By nature, we have a right to the freedom of speech. This appeal to nature rather than God may sound more convincing to modern ears, but it really shouldn't be. And the reason is not far to seek. Within a pre-modern concept of nature, broadly speaking, a teleological or an Aristotelian concept of nature, it might make sense to appeal to nature in order to ground rights, norms, or concepts such as dignity. The inherent worth, the Würde, of human beings would be then derived from the station that they occupy in a natural order that has some goal. It is morally organized. Nature itself is somehow morally infused in that sense. And so violating the rights of humans and their dignity is actually going against nature's moral purpose. It is wrong as an objective, natural fact. But once modern science, the inheritance of enlightenment, delegitimized all teleological concepts of nature. One hero here is, of course, Spinoza. I share with Martin the interest in his philosophy. Once Enlightenment rationalism delegitimized all such views of nature, once we can no longer believe that there are ends in nature and blind mechanism takes over as the Enlightenment's only valid description of nature, the idea of natural, inalienable rights becomes as empty as the idea that humans receive their rights from God. Talk of inviolable human dignity, if it is supposed to draw on nature, thus becomes either deliberately fictional, at best, Article 1 of German Grundgesetz would be then a noble lie, a nice noble lie to tell people, or meaningless. The Enlightenment science has in fact refuted the truth of the Declaration of Independence and of Article 1. Blind evolution endows clever animals like us with all sorts of desires, powers, and urges, not with human rights or with human dignity. In other words, there is a sense perhaps this is surprising, in which a pre-modern understanding of truth or nature could seem to be a necessary condition of universalism. Post-metaphysical liberals, if they purport to endorse Enlightenment universalism at all, and many of them pretend to do so, especially when criticizing, bashing, and mocking identity politics, do not just endorse it without sufficient proof or rational foundations. Rather, they draw on a metaphysical tradition that they repudiate. In this view, it is not surprising that their universalism very often tends to hypocrisy, a politics that's only packaged in the language of equality as an absolute norm, but then is really just the opposite of abolitionist democracy. It's all about defending the interests of we the people, of those who are already in power, if you'd like, the so-called white men. Here is another way to say the same thing. Enlightenment is not, in some sense, is not the origin of universalism, but in many ways, its greatest enemy. Enlightenment science and philosophy did not give us universal dignity of humanity or inalienable rights, but just the opposite. It undermines the grounds of such concepts, giving us forms of nihilism. Arguably, if Enlightenment is related to Western traditions of colonialism and enslavement rather than to abolitionism, the reason is not that it produced universalism, the alleged ideology of the White West, but precisely that it undermined universalism. And the question is whether there still is a way to defend an abolitionist concept of universalism. I want to suggest that that's the question to which Kant's philosophical revolution, really as a whole, was designed to respond. If an anti-universalist nihilism is a consequence of Enlightenment philosophy, then Kant's critique of pure reason could have been called almost a critique of Enlightenment just as well. It is now easy to forget, but leftist politics, even revolutionary leftist politics, finds its radical origins in Kant's critique of reason. As Heinrich Heine accurately put it, he got it, I think, this seemingly conservative philosophy professor was, in fact, an Alleszermalmender, an all-destroyer, this is a quote from Heine, who in the realm of thought, I'm quoting Heine, much surpassed Maximilian Robespierre in terrorism. Whereas Robespierre managed to chop a king's head off, says Heine, Kant toppled not just a head, some king's head, that's spießig for Heine. Quite literally, that's more or less the way he puts it.
What's spießig in English?
There's no translation, that's why I say spießig. Yeah.
What?
Petit bourgeois, that's not English.
Square, what is that? Okay.
It's an interesting fact that it's hard to translate.
Yeah, don't even start there.
That's right.
Sorry.
Kant toppled not a head, that's spießig, but rather a whole way of thinking. The critique of pure reason was a sword with which God himself was executed, not the king. It cancelled the authority of powers, both earthly and divine, replacing these authorities in the name of enlightenment with that of universalist humanism, a humanism that stands above the authority of God and thereby certainly above the authority of the state, not just the king, also the people. That Kant himself was not just a universalist, but also a child of his time, and made some racist, misogynist, and anti-Semitic comments cannot and really should not be denied. He argued, for example, that humans achieve this is a quote, achieved their greatest perfection in whites, while yellow Indians have a meager talent, blacks are far below them, and at the lowest point are the part of the American people. But in the current discussion of Kant, the aim of exposing these comments is not so much to hold Kant responsible for failing to live up to his own ideal of human dignity. It is rather to use his personal failings in order to delegitimize the universalist idea of dignity itself. The underlying charge is not that Kant the man was a racist, which he was, but that his universalism is actually a racist ideology for privileged white men. That Enlightenment humanism, it's important for me to emphasize that the authority of this value of universalism is not the basis from which to criticize unjust laws and even to abolish discriminatory power structures that ought to be transformed, but rather the mask that allows those in power to exclude and exploit. In what is probably the defining article on the topic in the United States, the late Charles Mills, a philosopher that I met more than once and respected a lot, despite serious disagreements, obviously, argues that Kant's universalism is responsible for this is now a quote from Charles Mills, for the division between the Herrenvolk and Untermenschen, persons and subpersons, upon which Nazi history would later dwell. I think if you accept that sentence, you notice that we're just a bit away from saying Grundgesetz 1 is continuous with the Nazi heritage, rather than the alternative to it. Arguments of this sort are accepted with enthusiasm nowadays on campuses, certainly in America. They create a culture in which the shortcomings of universalist humanism are not just criticized, this would be exactly the Kantian practice, but cancelled. And I think there is such a thing. Now, commentators writing in solidarity, as one should, and I allow myself to say, or to hope that I do, with African Americans, LGBTQ, women, and other silenced and discriminated groups, say Palestinians, sometimes oppose a critique of identity politics or post-colonialism, presenting it as white fragility or as an oversensitivity of comfortable liberals in the center. Jan Werner Müller, another thinker that I respect, speaks for many on the left when he dismisses this fairy tale of critiques of identity, the fairy tales about some illiberal left. It is always possible, writes Müller, to define some juicy anecdotes about the excesses of anti-racist leftists, but cancel culture remains only a marginal phenomenon. Identity politics is not about locking people in a would-be prison of identity, he writes, but about demanding fundamental rights. I think that the debate about Kant should make it clear that for better or worse, at stake is something very serious, not a juicy anecdote. We're not getting rid of some white old man. On the line is the fate of universalist thinking as we enter an epoch of fighting against far-right politics, ethnic nationalism. I mean, look at my own country, Israel, as we are entering days of fighting global disasters. It makes a difference whether we insist on the idea of universal human dignity as a compass and even as an abolitionist weapon, or create a society in which this notion is mocked and despised. To understand the stakes of this Kant debate, it is useful for a moment, I won't do that too long, don't worry, it's useful to go back to Heidegger. Just a small excursus.
I do worry already.
Yeah. Going too fast from German Grundgesetz to Heidegger is not. This card-carrying member of the Nazi party was a racist, anti-Semite. This goes without saying. But this fact alone does not reduce his philosophy to racism. Neither do the awful, but philosophically not that essential anti-Semitic comments that Heidegger makes in his later writings. Heidegger's philosophy does invite racism, I think, opens at least a door to racism, in the letter of humanism, on humanism, and arguably already in Being and Time, not merely in the later discovered sensation of the Black Notebooks, say, by seeking to overcome humanism through a new concept of humanity. His philosophy is, at least, I'm actually charitable here to Heidegger, and I think one maybe should be, at least a temptation to racism, because it replaces the abstract notion of humanity by an embodied, concrete subject of identity as a locus of dignity. However, it is just this feature of Heidegger's thinking that also makes him a natural go-to philosopher for leftist thinkers who now focus on embodied identity consciousness instead of the abstraction, on gender, on race, on ethnicity. It is nowhere than in this turn from Kant's abstract enlightenment to Heidegger's concrete subject that the predicament of a leftist anti-humanism, and I think that this is a trend that we're seeing, the anti-humanism, we can talk about that too, becomes clear. Think about it. Left Heideggerianism, we know left Hegelianism, left Heideggerianism should have been a contradiction in terms. But Heidegger is or was, and we can also speak about why maybe was, very often the go-to philosopher of a certain left. He is a thinker who has precisely as a right-wing philosopher, celebrated identity against the Kantian abstraction. Now, against this lingo of concrete identity, Kantians insist on the concept of humanity as fundamentally, inescapably abstract, independent of biological, sociological, national, or historical considerations. Such universalism was, in many ways, biblical in origin, and it was familiar to the Enlightenment's natural law tradition that preceded Kant and produced, let us be clear, the worst type of positivist nihilism. What made Kant's formulation epoch-changing was his ability to ground the abstract idea of humanity neither as a religious concept that draws on faith, nor as a scientific positivist one. With Kant, humanity was discovered for the first time as essentially only a moral concept. You can only understand the concept of humanity as a moral concept, and one would have to think what that implies. By insisting that humanity can only be such a moral concept, Kant treated it as a metaphysical notion that depends on one characteristic only: freedom. Whereas animal species are defined by concrete biological facts about their body, whereas what animals are supposed to do can be known empirically by studying what they actually are doing, humans are distinguished not by different biological facts about them, but because they transcend such facts. They are free because, and this is now important, or if reasons and justifications are capable of determining their action, not just causes. Moral percepts apply to them, not just power. They are human because who they are cannot be reduced to their concrete identity. It depends neither on what they are nor on how they live, but on being open to their duty, what they ought to be doing. Human beings are thus not primarily, and this is an interesting thing to consider, human beings are not primarily the subjects or the beings that have rights. They are primarily the beings that can be responsible, the beings that have duties. People speak nowadays about animal rights, I think for good reasons. But human beings command absolute respect, absolute dignity, not because they have rights, but because they are the type of beings that have duties. And you cannot say, of animals as having duties. I can speak about a person as failing to do their duty, not about a dog or a horse. It is only the abstract idea of humanity then, as independent from nature, that give humans the dignity that they command. By contrast to natural beings that belong to an aimless nature, humans are free to set ends. Therefore, they themselves ought to be categorically treated as ends, never as means. They don't just have value. Things can acquire value by being used and by being sold. Rather, they have a dignity that's, this is now a quote from Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative, or just at the margins of it, they have a dignity that's exalted above all values. That is, it's absolute, Kant would have said sublime, and that's another interesting way of putting it. Slavery and colonialism are the paradigmatic violations of this dignity because they are premised on the systematic reduction of humans to mere means rather than ends, thus having a price. Tolerating such institutions or such political traditions in the name of any circumstance or value, say prosperity, order, peace, democratic consensus, doesn't just normalize an injustice, it deforms the ground of justice. Therefore, no constitution, no law or political order that protects slavery or colonialism can have legitimate authority. It mutilates the foundation of all values and thereby the foundations of all authority at all. That's the origin that makes Kant's thinking, I think, revolutionary, the only foundation of modern abolitionist thinking I can think of. I'm sure this can be discussed. The significance of this point, I really think, cannot be stressed enough. Dignity, abstraction, and universalism all go hand in hand. It is only because humans are free, that is, independent of facts that determine identity, that they command dignity. And it is because this independence from fact can only be abstract that it is necessarily universal. Once this metaphysical equation is rejected and identity becomes the standard of thinking, it makes little difference whether the category of identity is then race, gender, nation, class, or culture. The fragile foundation of human dignity is compromised. Humanism is compromised. And a door is open to the idea that it might be okay to use human beings. Certainly it would be unclear on what basis an abolitionist commitment that's higher than positivist law would be defended. And yet, and with this I'm going to finish, and yet the most important aspect of this commitment to abstract humanism is not its opposition to so-called identity politics, and I want to emphasize that. Rather, it is its opposition to the fake universalism of the liberal center. I would say a fake universalism that we're also witnessing in Germany, and that's something that can be discussed. Whereas Kant's universalism is based on a moral metaphysical abstraction, the idea of humanity, modern liberalism actually consists in rejecting this abstraction and the duties that it entails. Instead of abstract metaphysical humanity, liberals speak of citizens, a concrete and exclusive identity group that's anything but universal. This is the clearest in their attachment not to the category of humans, but to the national patriotic we that forever drives politics. Instead of duties to mankind, modern liberalism speaks very often of cultural identity and of interests. Kant would agree on this point, as I would, with the so-called identitarian post-colonial left. Short of a robust moral commitment to humanism, liberalism, as we have come to know it, is identity politics of those already in power. It allows them to exploit the empty shells of a universalist moral lingo to maintain power structures that ought to be transformed. For me personally, the most obvious example of this is Israel. We Jews in Israel, allegedly the foundation of the Jewish and democratic rule of law, depends on the exclusion of some group, the Palestinians. The rule of law is our law. Dignity would have been the way to overcome that. The ought that human dignity commands as a categorical moral authority thus have a true revolutionary potential. It is our duty to create a society that's very different from ours, one in which women are not systematically used by men, one in which workers cannot be de facto owned by their employers, one in which black lives and Palestinian lives matter. But the uncompromising opposition to the fake universalism of the center can only be defended by true universalism, not by the concept of identity. I'm done.
Yes! Da ist natürlich
Well,
richtig Musik drin
there's
für uns jetzt hier
a
schon
lot
mal. Und
in
ich
it that we can discuss, and I would now like to make the attempt that I would like to do both in our discussion. I would like to talk about the theoretical questions that dominated your talk, the justification of universal norms and their relationship to democracy, that we discuss that part, but also the concrete political questions that are connected to it. Question of inequality, of violence in or emanating from democracy, and I hope that we manage to do that, that we can connect both. But before I invite Martin Saar to give his first reaction, to respond to this keynote, I would like to say that, well, we should discuss 3 to 4 bigger questions. One, the relationship of universalism to identity politics. This would be the first. The second would be universalism and human rights and democracy, or what justifies the authority of human rights. And connected to it and interwoven seems to be the question, but please correct me if I'm wrong, Martin Saar, the relationship between morals and the law, and this might also be a point where we could pick up the John Brown example, or forms of civil disobedience, of opposition, forms of protests, where we could discuss these. And a third complex could be the relationship between democracy and truth, or the authority of claims of truth. And I think that the starting point of the book, as well as the contribution today, is Israel, and I would also like to consider this as starting point of our discussion, the question what this discussion might mean for deliberations over the state of Israel, and also human rights and citizens' rights in the state of Israel. So this would be my idea, but I'm quite sure that also in between the different questions we will find interconnections. First, I would like to invite Martin Saar to respond and to raise first questions, and then we can further develop our discussion. Thank you very much. I would also say that not only as a motto, but also as a recommendation to read. The keynote has shown it. The book includes concrete political questions, and at the same time, there is a basic theoretical, philosophical reflection, which is quite impressive. And the idea that timely political questions, no matter whether we are philosophers or social scientists or others, and the basic and fundamental questions, and to connect both is a great thing that is really remarkable here, and which is also characteristic for the work of Carolin Emcke and the Streitraum, and you all know why you're here. I would like to start discussing 2 aspects. I think it's number 1, 2, and 4 of what Carolin Emcke has just said. So the first question would be, does Omri Boehm only reflect a US-led debate, or do we also see a polarization between 2 parts? On the one hand, universalist, and on the other hand, identity politics, which cannot be brought together if you read the feuilleton of the NZZ and also the FAZ. For example, you could come to that idea that also the German institutions and the German public and German faculty are part of this cultural debate. And then I would like to come to the very harsh and fundamental and breathtaking suggestions back to Kant, because this is also what this book is characterized by. And of course, the title of the book wants to put it at the forefront. So on the first aspect, Omri Boehm's intervention is interesting because he does not immediately say that the conflict between universalism and identity politics, or an orientation of the general politics and the concrete and specific issues of certain groups that raise their voices very loudly today, is applicable. And this is what the NZZ claims constantly, and the FAZ also. There are radicalized minorities who demand special rights and inclusion and the taking into account of their interests, whereas on the other hand, there is a group which is focused on the general well-being, and in the national realm, this means that it would be good for all German citizens. And you might remember the debate of Wolfgang Thierse that he launched 2.5 years ago, approximately. He said that in the SPD there are too many voices who are actually favoring individual groups and want to represent their interests, but there are also the normal and quotation marks Germans, and this should basically the objective or the target of a People's Party. And interestingly, Omri Boehm is not following in this in these steps or in this discussion, but there are some paragraphs where he characterizes the identity politics with words of the opposition, but this might be an attempt to explain how the state of the discussion is at the moment. But he actually says that those who speak on behalf of the normal Germans are not really universalists as such, but this is a fake universalism, which, and this is also part of the subtext, and I heard it at 2 different sections in your keynote. This is also a kind of identity politics, which is an identity politics of the majority. And this is quite an interesting aspect, and also spectacular and also provocative for the German discussion, which sometimes is too idle and says either you are universalists or you are focused on the rights of minorities. And there, I think, sometimes some political commentators are also responsible for this simplification of the debate. It is more complicated, and the German debate and its interesting aspects, for example, the topic of decolonization at the Humboldt Forum, or let's take all the questions surrounding cancel culture, they are more complicated. Here, the demand is that the usual perspectives and points of view, the history of the West and the history of the establishing of liberal democracies and rights is not as simple, and that perspectives need to be taken into account, which in a historic context came up at the same time with the universalism and enlightenment, and cannot be easily separated in this context, or we cannot abstract based on them, and they need to be seen as a background of philosophical principles and values. And the question whether our museums, our collections, or our cultural exchange, or our relationship to the countries of the global south should also be questions in a critical way, whether old dominances and dependencies continue apart from our self-understanding that from a point of view of universalism, of absolute justice, and that we think based on this, seems to be a self-reflective loop, of which Omri Boehm says that it has a universalist direction, but sometimes it misunderstands itself. Sometimes it considers it's an opposition of enlightenment and the human rights and the culture of the West, or Eurocentric perspective on the look at history. So basically we could say that where we have a differentiated debate, and Omri Boehm seems to advise that it is about universalist principles or points of view that are in dispute with each other. And it's not that one side says we should do away with universalism, we need particularism or identity, but it's much more about showing, with regard to certain topics of identity, that sometimes the universalities and equities are just claimed but not implemented. So it is a betrayed universalism, so to speak. And in this regard, we have inner universalist debates that evolve around what does it mean for everyone, also on all the continents. And in my good and optimistic moments, I do think that sometimes the German debates are helpful because it is painful to have a self-critical view on this debate, and the Humboldt Forum shows it. There are wounds that are being opened up, and the aggression that we see in the different stakeholder groups are quite deep. And this would be my question to Omri Boehm. Is this a description which makes sense? I do see it in his work, which wants to get away from this dichotomy, here universalism and here particularism, and aren't these disputes that are basically interconnected, and try to determine what it might mean to have a real or true universalist argumentation. And the second aspect is a little bit shorter and might be a little bit more technical, but maybe only at first sight. When Omri Boehm says we have to go back to Kant, or back to Kant could be the solution, then he connects it with the idea that the Kantian universalism, in his words, is radical, abstract, or absolute, because it does not try to determine concrete identities. And this is right if you know the categorical imperative of Kant. So good is what can be generalized, what's not only applicable to me and my neighbor, but applicable to everyone who, in this situation, seriously asks what might be the basis, the fundament on which everyone can decide without serving his or her own interests. And Omri Boehm says this is how we have to think universalism. We have to abstract from concrete identity. And I assume that he would also say deviating from concrete context or concrete history, which would make it a little bit more difficult from my point of view. But the moral core of a thinking of equity, of universality, in this spirit is not particularity and not anything special. This seems to be a strong demand, and Omri Boehm is quite right. Our basic law obliges the population, which wanted to give itself the constitution in 49, to fulfill this norm, to comply to this norm. The question only is whether the status or what's the justification of this norm. And this now brings me back to Kant, that this norm itself, to be under this general equity, is referring to a truth, as Omri Boehm said, and this is how I understand this sense of dignity. I mean, there is no truth. There is a truth that we relate to, we point to it, and we say, okay, this is why we should treat everyone equal. I would have understood it in a performative way, as an act of will, and this seems to be the wrong option from your point of view, because I would have thought that we want to, as a legal community and also as the German society in concrete terms, because our constitution is not the constitution of the world, but it's our constitution, that we want this norm to apply, and this is why we say it is unviolable. I would say that during we did not raise our hand when he asked us the first question, because it's self-evident. I mean, I don't think that anything is self-evident, so everything that came after that, I didn't have to listen to it, because the word self-evident was the problem already for me, but this was not your problem, was it? Well, yes, but the word create was also part of it. I thought that I'm not going to raise my hand when a justification of a norm is formulated from a theistic justification, but we can still debate the basic law and different perspectives and their connection. But you're right. I would say, and in the book you describe it in more detail, the truth as a point of relation, as irrespective of particular right views, and whether there was this truth, and as the philosopher Omri Boehm would have to explain it to us first, whereas the liberals, which is the one group, and the identity politicians on the other hand, make moderate concessions and have moderate demands. And at this point, I would just like to ask, how does the Kantian Boehm know that this is the truth about human beings? And he rightly says that it is a metaphysical claim. And then my question would be, in 2023, what gives us the certainty that we have the right metaphysical insights? And doesn't the intuition that we might need a pluralistic or a pluralized and more open perception of what we can relate to would make more sense?
I'd love to deal with these topics one after the other. I would like to have a bit of time for a first round in order to discuss the first question. And if I may, I'd like to add one aspect. So we talk about universalism and identity policy, and the question to what extent in the US debate we are dealing with caricatures of both themes, so to speak. And I would like to make a proposal, and that's what I would like to add, a proposal in order to understand identity policy so that it makes sense, i.e., an identity policy which understands itself as a universalist one. And I would like to give an example so that you know what I mean. Let's assume that there is a rule according to which only human beings who are taller than 1.80 meter are allowed to attend performances at Schaubühne. Now, maybe you have a written version of this rule, maybe not, but there are people of different sizes who want to enter the Schaubühne, and some may and others are not allowed to. But they don't know why. They've bought a ticket. It's the right day, the right time. And they may be confused. They don't understand why can't I get in? And they only find out in the course of time that there is a similarity between all those who are not admitted to the theater. And maybe never before in their lives they thought that their size, and how tall they are matters. Maybe it was important for them, maybe not. But all of a sudden, this particular feature, i.e. being taller than 1.8 meters, matters, because it becomes a factor of discrimination. Some are admitted, others are not allowed to enter the theater. So a universalist identity policy would agree or refer to abstract principles of non-discrimination and accept these principles. But in order to prove that some are excluded or discriminated against. Certain features or characteristics need to be mentioned. Could be sexuality, gender, race, whatever. In my case, in my example, it was just how tall people are. So as soon as people start talking about their height, their body size, they start struggling and discussing. I mean, why does it matter at all how tall I am? You only want to have people of the same height together. So maybe the door of the theater matters. Right. But the commonality, or what they share in this case, is a consequence of a discriminatory identity policy exercised at the entrance of the theater. So in order to show that I believe that the major interest Omri Boehm shows in his book, i.e., to argue in favor of a universalism which understands itself as which can be used as a criticism or as a means to criticize the current social or societal situation, you need an understanding or a concept of identity policy which allows for descriptions of inequalities or exclusions, and thus it cannot be abstract. I wonder, actually, whether it can be abstract. So this would be the aspect.
Let's see if I will manage, but I think I can answer relatively, my answer can be relatively short, in the sense that I think that we generally agree about what I'm trying to do and also about what one should do if that's the position that we're articulating. That is, I'm not per se against identity politics, also not, I'm not for colonialism, for example. I don't know if this surprises anybody. I think that the way to understand and to motivate what's being thought when we're asking to decolonize or when we're asking to fight in the name of this or that identity needs to be, in the end, understood in the notion, through the notion of humanity. And I do think that the notion of humanity can only be thought through this abstraction. So I'm not of the view, for example, I'm not an opponent of Black Lives Matter. I have a complicated relation, actually, to Black Lives Matter, because in my experience in the United States, very often the people who support Black Lives Matter takes a further step of saying universalist enlightenment is a reason why our lives do not matter. I don't walk that extra mile. But by all means, I wouldn't support all lives matter proposition. Of course, the proposition is true, but we're in complete agreement that we need to say Black Lives Matter, because the problem is that in the United States, they don't. And as Arendt, this is an interesting sentence coming from Arendt, if you're being attacked with a certain identity group, you have to also respond by that identity.
Man kann sich nur mit der Identität wehren, in der man auch angegriffen ist.
That's right.
Das
And that's a principle that is not an absolute principle, but it is to some extent true. It is largely true, and I am not against it. What I'm criticizing in the book, harshly, is the extra mile, the extra kilometer. We're back in civilized Europe. The extra kilometer that is being walked.
Civilized?
That was conscious irony. The extra kilometer that is being walked and is being walked. When people say what we need to undermine when we fight our identity battles is the idea of universal humanity. The notion of dignity, of human dignity itself, is inherently racist. That's also what I identify in the Kant debate. This is why Kant, for me, is so relevant here, because going after Kant there is not just going after his criticism, his racism. It is going after his articulation of the categorical imperative as a foundation of abstract.
Ich glaube, der Unterschied oder die unterschiedliche Lesart, die habe ich jetzt auch bei Martin Saar.
Well, I also understand Martin Saar in this way. There is a different interpretation, which is based on the question whether you have to see the left, maybe the American left in brackets, or the identity policy of the American left needs to be understood exclusively as a fight on the basis of this particular position, which is against universalism. And there, I believe, I'd like to say that this is a kind of distortion, or it's risky. At least it's risky because it seems that you go and formulate claims not in the name of gender and race, but in the name of universalist norms or standards. And this is the only possibility to discuss situations in which these standards are not respected by reference to gender and race. And maybe a postscriptum would be necessary with respect to the question whether this is an extreme position or a minority position only. What do you think?
I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure about my own experiences. My understanding is, I would completely agree that in order to fight, to defend the rights of discriminated identity groups, you have to fight in the name of those identity groups. You cannot do that without appealing to the concept of gender, of race, of history, of ethnicity, and so forth. Absolutely. That's, philosophers would say, that's a necessary and insufficient condition. Another necessary but insufficient condition, and maybe it's important then in this room, maybe that's my answer. I agree, it's insufficient. Another necessary but insufficient condition is the notion of human dignity, universal human dignity, that is, that can only be thought as abstract. By the way, there's no contradiction, right? You think that we are human beings and command dignity for that reason, and that for discriminated groups of human beings who have to fight for that dignity, they have to do that in the name of this or that identity group. And count me in anytime. By the way, I think in Germany that's familiar, for example. Count me in for fighting for the rights of the Palestinians. Count me in. But once you walk the extra kilometer and you say the reason why we were discriminated against is the abstract notion of humanity, I think that's completely wrong. And it's completely wrong because of something that Martin was mentioning, and is very true about my position. When people say that they're universalists, often those discriminated groups were discriminated by people who called themselves universalists, by all means, but are not universalists. They're just those who speak in the name of we the people, we the American people, that excluded enslaved black people, with the German people that can exclude Jews, we know, can exclude other groups today, and also can exclude also Jews today. In Israel, we, the Jewish people, obviously excludes other groups. If that is universalism, and that is very often what gets characterized as universalism, this is not universalism. If that were universalism, that would have to be criticized as the identity politics of white men, and Martin is exactly right to say that my position is to say, look, this is an inner debate between identity politics and identity politics. Both are wrong. What we need to have is the conversation between universalists, and we will figure out how we fight without compromising for those rights of those minorities.
Für mich ist immer der Testfall für Universalismus.
And yet, for me, the test case for universalism is whether people who call themselves universalists agree to also fight against trans or homophobia, because otherwise it's just identity policy. Would you want to answer to this particular aspect once more? Otherwise, I would move over to the second aspect. Well, I agree to Carolin Emcke. The extra mile position is extremely rare in Germany. There is hardly anybody who goes public in Germany who says, let's call it a day. I don't want any universalist positions anymore. And yet, I do remember the morning we talked about abolitionism in the Streitraum here. But I would like to come back to one aspect you mentioned in your presentation, because it matters. The context in which universalist teachings come into being, because these cultures were inherently sexist and racist and had a lot of discrimination against individual groups. And I mean, of course, you can go and say this is his teaching and there's the cultural context, but that's not the way I would like to do it. So what about the reference of enlightenment? Well, I'm not sure whether you can really draw a line between the politics of enlightenment and the cultural context of the time. So there's a certain skepticism here whether you can really take the values out of the context, I'm not sure. Because there is not a clear cut, and you cannot go and say abstract here, concrete there. It doesn't work.
It can get very technical very fast in this conversation. I think you're very right that it's not too technical. No, I'm not going to do it. But it's very difficult to do that Trennung, as you say. Maybe it's impossible to do the Trennung. I think one thing that I was trying to do in this book is to actually say, if you want to defend universalism, you have to be willing to accept that this Trennung is at least possible. And if it's impossible, count me in, not just for the marches with Black Lives Matter, but for being for identity politics, because then universalism does not exist. If we can have a universalist philosophy and politics, it needs to be based on the ability of articulating principles that do not, at least are not reducible to their cultural surroundings. And I agree that it's not obvious that we can do that, but the assumption that this cannot be done is also, to a certain degree, begging the question, because it is already assuming the conceptual scheme, the philosophy, in which you cannot think universalism, right? The reason why people assume that they cannot think universalism is that they don't think you can have a thought that has a meaning that's independent of its context. And universalism depends on actually doing that, which is, I agree, not obvious that this can be done. That would be the challenge.
Das führt natürlich direkt zu der
This, of course,
zu der
brings
zweiten
us to
Frage.
the second question, the question of, and I would like to put it as follows, the question of authority of truth, or the origin of knowledge or belief, or the reason, yes, the reason for it. And there's a beautiful story around Toni Morrison about a family which had the ritual in the morning that the mother asks her children, what have you learned today which is true? And the second question, and how do you know that it's true? And Martin Saar would like to know what makes you sure? I mean, how do you know? And if I might add to it.
Not as strong as it used to be.
No, that's not enough. Na, vielleicht, wenn ich's
So, if I might add to it, or give a concrete example. Of course, the example that you brought up in your text of John Brown is an example which is exactly evolving around that question. All the questions referring to civil disobedience, protest, betrayal. Let's think about Edward Snowden or the climate protests, or whether it's the John Brown example, which does not only involve civil disobedience, but it is a violent opposition. Of course, this is also a large spectrum, but of course, the more necessity for a justification, and of course, this at its core refers to morals and politics. And how do you know, or we know as actors, as stakeholders, that what we refer to, what we claim, and what is not part of the law and the self-evident part in our time, that it's legitimate? So what are the reasons, or how do you justify these claims?
Question to answer, obviously, and so we will not get an easy answer or an answer at all, but my way of dealing with the challenge. One thing, again, technical but interesting, I want to at least mention this, because Martin and I, we share a passion for Spinoza. Of course, Spinoza is the interesting thinker who has an answer to that. It is the idea that truth is its own sign. When you know something, you know that you know it. You cannot think otherwise.
Als die Habermasianerin zwischen den beiden Spinoza-Köpfen hier könnte ich natürlich sagen, auch
I could also say that Habermas also has a response to it. And
to hear your formulation of that answer and to discuss it. My position would be that the Spinozist answer cannot be the answer. That is, it is not the case that when you know something, you know that you know it. That truth, when you think truth, you cannot think otherwise. And for that reason, you think it. We know that human dignity is actually violable. That's the most beautiful thing about, by the way, this is Navid Kermani once told me that in a radio interview. He said, that's the beauty of the sentence, die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. We know that it is antastbar overall. And the beauty of the statement is that it's counterfactual. Anyway, there is a question of how can we know? There is also the question whether it is grounded in Grundgesetz, in the sovereignty of the German people, or in the agreement of the German people, which, if I understood you correctly, and let me know if I didn't, that you thought that it does draw in the end of we, the German people, I'm a citizen, agreed that this would be our shared value. First, about the question of knowledge. I do not know that human beings have this absolute dignity. What I think I do know is that if human beings exist, then they have this absolute dignity. It is possible, and one could say, after Darwin, likely, even though I don't really believe that either, that human beings do not exist. That is, that we are just clever animals. That our relation to the environment is a relation of animals of this species. Our relation to the environment is broadly causal. It is sophisticated, but we're just part of blind nature. It is possible. part of the maneuver that I was trying to introduce with Kant, and this is Kant's maneuver, and again, very difficult to defend, and maybe we cannot defend it, is to say the concept of humanity can only be thought through the concept of freedom. That is our ability to set ends, not to be determined when setting the ends. That's a very high bar of what it means to be a human being. It's possible that we are reducing the concept of human beings to a biological concept, and in that sense, that we're not speaking about humans. And we must then admit the term "die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar" is a nice noble lie, which then would be exactly what the way you characterized it. It would be, we decided that in our society, this is how we would like to live. Now, it's nice that this is how you or we decided that this is how we decided to live, but then that makes it antastbar, die Würde des Menschen, because we could have also decided otherwise. The question whether the dignity of humanity depends on anybody's will, a king, the German people, my God, the Israeli people, the American people, the question whether the idea that a certain dignity is absolute, cannot be violable, cannot be violated. If it depends on a will of a people, then it can be violated. It can be violated if this community would decide that it does want to violate it. What I want to say here is that Grundgesetz 1 can only be based on something that's higher than the decision we made together. The decision we made together precisely because we have this shy epistemology. We cannot know the truth, so we can only know what we've agreed together. I would start rather by saying, if anything can have absolute worth, then that is the dignity of humanity derived from the notion of freedom. I would agree that I do not know that we have that. However, I would say also this. If human beings don't exist in the sense that I described, if there is no freedom in that sense, there's also no true authority. And therefore, no government has genuine authority in any sense. No one would. The notion of authority collapses, and everything is reduced to a question of what we decide about, who has the power, and so forth and so forth. And we will be in a, I think, problematic game of identity-power relations. And the standard of saying with John Brown, I will take the law into my own hands and go against the law, even though the German people decided on a certain law, John Brown would be wrong by that standard. He would be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is what I'm trying to resist. One last thing, I don't want to talk too much. John Brown, especially in the example of John Brown, because it is so violent, there is a question of how do you know? Often we don't know what's just. I think we often, however, do know what is injustice. And the ability to say that a certain reduction of human beings to mere means as a systematic, as a form of law, I would argue that we do know that that's a violation of the very notion of justice. When it gets more specific than that, you know, when we're going to look at the tax clauses on your salary, and you say taxing this form of income harms human dignity, and for that reason we should not pay taxes. That becomes very messy, and this is not what we're talking about. But we know that colonialism, we know that slavery, we know that occupation are forms of violating justice and violating the very notion of law in a way that I think is clear enough. By the way, one last thing now. I'm not against violence. However,
Das unterscheidet uns beide.
Well, this distinguishes the two of us.
I'm always against terrorism, and I think there is such a thing. Sometimes violence can be justified. And that's important because nowhere, at no point would it be just to use terrorism to fight for justice. At no point whatsoever. So in a way it takes a sting, at least of that part of the question, that you don't need to know that how do I know that, that I'm acting justly because I'm going to go and blow up a bus, I don't know where. That is never allowed if you understand the concept of justice we're talking about. Violence, you will tell me in a moment, Colin. I would be surprised if you're always against violence. I mean, there are just wars. I don't know you as a pacifist, but you'll explain in a moment. Anyway, that takes away the sting of having to know that you're just when you're acting violently, because you're never going to be blowing up a bus somewhere. You are never going to be attacking innocent civilians. That can be never legitimate. What can be legitimate, of course, is attacking soldiers. What can be legitimate is fighting a war, which is not very controversial.
Okay, ich würde ganz gerne.
Well, I would like, with a view to the time, I would like to set aside enough time to talk about Israel, but I think it's a very important aspect, so I would like to give the floor back to Martin Saar and also the question, and I would also like to add to it, and then we can also discuss Israel.
Well, it's getting very specific now, but there are two aspects that matter. On the one hand, there is the more theoretical question: does Kant's philosophy offer us a solid basis in order to say what is right, even if the rest of the world says it's wrong? It's a political question, but this is a highlight, so to speak, of politics and of philosophy. Now, violence and the escalation of violence in a time in which the political consensus was that more peaceful means could help. There was a lot of violence used. That's certainly a generational problem. Who says or feels entitled to say that a given situation is a disturbance of the public order? The John Brown dimension is also claimed by militants today, because people go and say this is for just reasons, but others often go, it's not legitimate. Yeah, but then you have very different means, and you have to be careful. And we need to differentiate between philosophical and moral questions and reasonings, which maybe not correspond to the current law, i.e., a symbolic violation of the rules, which is being risked and also might trigger the impact of the criminal law or public action and addressing the public and a society in order to appeal in the name of shared principles of the rule of law. And that's the interesting bit when you talk about the last generation or climate protesters, or to do something in order with reference to the Declaration of Independence and its claim to equality and freedom, and to nevertheless distinguish the different forms of protest, including the illegitimate ones. And that's why the John Brown figure is probably an extreme case or example, and probably not the best way to expand the paradigm of civil disobedience. And Martin Luther King would be the second example we would have to look at when looking at the non-violent civil or civilian forms of resistance. And yet, this is connected, and the question is, what can be legitimized politically? And yet, I'm getting nervous because I'm kind of surprised in view of the assessment of what is violence and what is terrorism or declared as violence or terrorism. If it's meant to be more than my side is always moving on the humanitarian and better or juster side. I'm not comfortable with this particular distinction.
I want to shift the burden of proof here.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the programs that were supposed to emancipate slaves, not through civil war, but through negotiation. Roughly, they were supposed to proceed by giving tax caps to the states that would have agreed within a process of decades to liberate slaves.
Can you repeat this? I don't understand
Yes,
the mechanism.
giving tax cuts
Yeah.
to states that were supposed to would have liberated slaves. This is one example. Of course,
Okay.
it never happened, but this is one example.
Okay.
In the negotiation, what there would have been ways to compensate slaveholders and the states that would have changed the laws, American states that would have changed their laws such that the slaves would be liberated for their lost property.
Mm-hmm.
This would have taken a lot of time, and this would have reaffirmed the logic that those slaves were owned by right. The idea that abolishing this institution by violence is less violent than letting, what was it, I think around 3 or 4 million slaves be enslaved for more decades. By reaffirming the logic that in a democracy you can have a system of law that's legally holding slaves doesn't strike me as less violent. That's what the debate is about. That's why I'm with John Brown. By the way, I would not be with John Brown, and here one would just have to go and check the historical details. If John Brown went and terrorized innocent civilians in order to terrorize the whites, I'm not on board. There is such a thing. If John Brown wanted to go and start an attack on the military, the slaveholders, and so forth, in order to demand liberation, I am on board. Harper's Ferry was, yeah, I understand.
no.
Harper's Ferry was a military arsenal. Of course, that was would have been just the first step, but was a military arsenal. The Civil War was fought between militaries. That's for that side of the debate. So I'm not for violence. I think violence should be avoided at all costs. No, I think some people on the left are, right. Some people, there is sometimes a celebration of violence on the left. I'm nowhere near that. I just want to point out that very often when, and this is not to you, Carolin, but say, Kaube writes this review of my book in FATS, accuses me of basically accepting even terrorism in the name of universalism. No, but I don't. That's not what's interesting. What's interesting about this is something completely else. That very often the people who claim to be the moderates because they want to avoid violence, are already participating in this act of exclusion that's inherently extremely violent, just not to the groups that are recognized as
okay. Okay.
and that's also the way I see the negotiations, say, in of the liberation of the slaves.
Okay, das ist, leuchtet mir sofort ein.
Yeah, that's clear. I do agree. This is evident. Shifting the burden of proof. I mean, I still think that you have the burden of proof, Omri, but the description of systemic violence shows that there is violence in oppression, exclusion, discrimination. And this helps us understand that it's not as simple as this is terrorism and there's the rule of law.
Martin Luther King, much more, you know, I'm a huge fan of Martin Luther King, in that sense, more than of John Brown. By the way, Martin Luther King is also not as attractive today to many of my colleagues in the United States as used to be, as he should be. Cornel West here is a beautiful exception. But Martin Luther King, an unjust law is no law at all, is an interesting question in relation to the Rechtsstaat, the rule of law, and whether we can stand by that sentence. Again, can we say, forget violence for a moment, can we say an unjust law is no law at all? How does it stand in relation to the principle of the rule of law? I think that it can be, but that is something that we still need to learn how to think that. For most people who think through Grundgesetz, they would not be able to think that. I think that the first article of Grundgesetz could have been a way of understanding that statement. But you'd have to go very far into Kant and yeah.
Ich würde ganz gern eben was ich jetzt sagen würde.
Now, the ultimate aspect of the book, the point of escape, if you wish, would be Israel. And that's what I would like to talk about. Because reflecting upon radical universalism would be reflecting upon Israel. I might go and assume that your argument for dignity, abstraction, and radical universalism is also very much referring to the law of the nation state of Israel, which determines the Jewish character of the state. I don't have the words right now. I don't remember. But I think it's 11 articles concerning the nationhood or the nation state of Israel. And the first article is the state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, which has its right to national and cultural self-determination. And it's unique for the Jewish people. That's what the first article says. Now, would that be the horizon, maybe? Or what you question or would like to doubt, basically?
The basic law, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, is a recent, can't remember when it was I think 2019.
2018, Juli.
18. It was a recent development, an extremely important development. Some people, I think, unterschätzt.
Yeah? Underestimate.
Underestimated. Interesting that I need to think in German. The underestimated the significance of this law. However, it is not the main issue. The main issue is, says the Israeli Declaration of Independence of 1948, that, by the way, doesn't use those terms, but establishes Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Something very interesting to remember, the Declaration of Independence of Israel never says Jewish and democratic. The term doesn't appear. Not unimportant either. The, someone said correctly that my previous book on Israel was a political, philosophical book, and that this book on universalism is a philosophical, political book. And I think that this is a good way of understanding the relations between them. In the book on Israel, what I was trying to do is to show the type of transformation that Israel would have to go through in order, and this, by the way, this closes the circle nicely, I think, not to go against Jewish identity or Palestinian identity, which I think matters in principle, and matters because of history, but would not be constituted on the basis of identity, but rather on the basis of human dignity as a foundation of law. And from human dignity would derive national rights. So it is not national sovereignty of the Jews that grounds the state of Israel, but rather democracy. And from that, you derive national rights of Jews and of Palestinians. One of the mottos to Radikaler Universalismus is a quote from Foucault. The we must always come at the end of a discussion, never at the beginning. And that is, in a way, what I was trying to have a program for that in the book on Israel. Israel is founded as a state founded by the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, a government of the Jewish people, by the Jewish people, for the Jewish people, because the Jews are the people, and in the Jewish state. Trying to undermine this and say the people are the citizens as such, which still does not mean that you cannot defend the right of self-determination of Jews and their identity in that state. How to think that about memory, Holocaust, Nakba, how to think that about constitution, how to think that about the structure of the state. That's basically the program. I'll say another thing that's interesting, I think. The nation-state law has become an object that is attacked rightly, but is too easy to attack. Think about Israel's basic law, basic law, human dignity and freedom. Israel has such a basic law. It was constituted, if I'm not mistaken, take this with a grain of salt, in 92. Hallmark of the Jewish and democratic state. Here's one thing that is conspicuously absent from that basic law: equality. The right of equality does not follow in the basic law that guards human dignity and freedom. Equality does not follow. That is a type of politics that I'm trying to change, and I think in a Jewish and democratic state, it will not change. That is a type of politics that I'm trying to prove.
Ich hätte zwei Nachfragen, wenn ich darf.
I would like to ask
Das
two
erste
follow-up
wäre,
questions. First is the following.
was verloren ginge.
What would be lost if this claim of this Jewish and democratic, of Jewish and democratic would be uncoupled, or if there's a more universalist form of democracy perception, what would be lost? I could come up with quite a few things. I would just like to mention historically understandable ideas of a place where you're not being persecuted. So this is just my first question. What would get lost? What would be lost? And my second question is, because you've already mentioned it, refers to the basic rights. So Israel has this peculiarity, and I think we might have to explain it, that there is no constitution. So my question is, and I assume your answer will be no, but I would like to hear your explanation, whether this would be one of your instruments. So could a constitution or a different kind of social contract, I mean, there are different wordings for it, and at the moment, would this be a possibility from your point of view to introduce this idea of equality, which has not been laid out in the basic rights, and to safeguard it also for the Palestinians?
What goes lost? I think that you're right that a lot goes lost and a lot is won. What will be lost in a state that will not be a Jewish and democratic state is Jewish sovereignty. The idea that the Jews have the right to their own sovereign state. That would be lost. By the way, I just had a debate some months ago with the Israeli philosopher. I think some people here would know him, Moshe Halbertal. I was trying to tell him, the notion of Jewish sovereignty basically means, he was trying to say, he's a very capable philosopher. He was saying...
They're also non-capable philosophers.
We know them.
Yeah, no.
No, Moshe Halbertal, I have serious disagreements with him. He's a very interesting, worthy person to debate this with. Because my criticism is harsh. He said, Israel is completely equal for everybody. And I said, the notion of Jewish sovereignty shows that those who are citizens but are not Jewish are not equal in the Jewish state. He said, Israel is not about Jewish sovereignty. It's not about Jewish sovereignty. And what do you mean by sovereignty? I answered him that by sovereignty I mean exactly what Lincoln said at Gettysburg. To say that Israel is a Jewish state, it means that the Jews are the people of the state. It's a state of the Jewish people. That's just a basic statement of Zionism today, which means that if the Jews are the people, it is the state, the government of the Jews, by the Jews, for the Jews. Non-Jews are not part of the equation. Then he said, Israel does not assert Jewish sovereignty. The Knesset is a sovereign, the parliament, and everybody can vote. It's completely false. First, in Israel, not the Knesset is a sovereign, but the people. The Knesset only represents them. Second, who's allowed to vote and who's not allowed to vote is decided by ethnicity in the following way. First, obviously, whereas Israel has ruled the West Bank and Gaza, but let's stick to the West Bank for a moment, for more than 50 years, and has Jews voting in the West Bank, and the laws that Israel legislates apply to them in the West Bank, no one in their right mind would think that the Palestinians living on the same territory would vote. So the one man, one vote principle is decided on the basis of ethnicity. Says Halbertal, says liberal Zionists, only once we have ensured Jewish majority would we recognize a one man, one vote principle. Which shows you that the notion of Jewish sovereignty is primary to the question who votes. An example of my position on abolitionist democracy, I refuse to accept that national unity is prior to the question who gets to vote and who doesn't. And I agree with critics of Zionism that one reason why Israel occupies the West Bank and one reason why it would not give up on the West Bank is that it doesn't recognize the human dignity of those Palestinians. If it had, it would have let them vote or let them establish a state. It can continue colonizing them because it doesn't take them to be subjects of dignity. That's why I believe that we need to reconstruct the way we think. By the way, I'm not an anti-Zionist. Reconstruct the way we understand Zionism such that it would defend the rights of Jews and Palestinians, including the national rights of Jews and Palestinians, but without compromising on human dignity realized through equal citizenship to all. A lot of things will go lost. Here's one thing, and that needs to be discussed without going all the way to Carl Schmitt. If the Jews will not be the sovereign, the Jews will not have the right to decide on war. Can be discussed.
Constitution.
Yes,
Yeah.
Constitution. One thing that was not mentioned in your comments but was obviously in the background is the current situation in Israel. I think it's uncontroversial, probably not that controversial in this room, that the Israeli government is currently attacking the rule of law and its foundation. One of the main demands in the last weeks of the opposition, not just in parliament, but also the resistance in the streets to this government, is to constitute a constitution, which Israel has never established, as you've said. Israel has no constitution, and Israel also doesn't have real basic laws. We've been speaking the language of basic laws, but there are basic laws that can be changed by a simple majority. In 1948, when Israel was established by the Declaration of Independence, many people do not know this, the Declaration of Independence dictated that by October of the same year, 1948, Israel would have to adopt a constitution. So many people today in the resistance to the government demand a constitution as the answer to the government's attack on the rule of law. I'm broadly speaking against that, but not completely, and I can explain. First, Israel does not have the right to write a constitution as long as it occupies the Palestinians. This is not just a moralistic statement. It is a statement of that I think should have been obvious to every legal expert. As long as the borders of the state and the borders of its sovereignty are not clear at all, but it is crystal clear who will vote on that constitution, whether it is adopted or not. This constitution would not be a democratic constitution, but actually a constitution that undermines democratic rights, because it would cement Israel's right to free sovereignty, while at the same time also cementing the supreme law that controls the Palestinians in a constitution, without them being part of it. It is, by the way, familiar.
Darf ich
Yes, please.
nachfragen?
May I ask a follow-up
Also wenn
question? So,
ich verstehe,
I mean,
ich verstehe das Normative. Also ich
do
verstehe,
understand the normative aspects. I do understand when you say there cannot first be a constitutional process and then the question of occupation will be discussed. But my question is, will the occupation issue be discussed without such a process, or put differently, when this is the prerequisite for the other and needs to be, do you think that this is a realistic idea? I'm sure that many of us remember this question, which has been raised in the past many times already, and many of us considered it quite unlikely when it comes to the Gaza Strip that the settlers from this region would actually leave, and they left. And I'm laughing about myself because I hear this question that I have wondered about many times in the past, but now directed to you. How realistic is it, or what is your idea of the change of the state of occupation?
We can, how did Zizek say? We can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of capitalism. It is very hard to imagine the end of the Besatzung, but I would say that if Israel now would constitute a constitution, ending the Besatzung would be more difficult, not less difficult, because its supreme law would actually prevent some of the structural changes that would have to take place in order to end the Besatzung. So a constitution can only be adopted either once there is a two-state solution, agreed separation from the Palestinians, or as a founding act of a certain federative constellation. I do support, because this is actually important, relevant to what you're saying, Carolin. I do support having a discussion about a constitution, and I've actually I've done that in Haaretz a couple of weeks ago. Basically, I'm just repeating what I wrote there in Hebrew, basically saying, look, we do not have the right to write a constitution. Also, you guys, the constitution, you're already showing what constitution you want to write, and it's going to be a Jewish and democratic constitution also for the Palestinians in the West Bank and within Israel. So that's not going to be a legitimate constitution. However, it is very important in this moment to have a conversation of what would be the right constitution to write, as actually the type of a process of Jews and Palestinians thinking together about such a constitution that can maybe unify them. There's a certain political group that would be then saying, look, every solution that does not abide by those principles will not be legitimate. Surprise, surprise, it begins with human dignity.
Ich würde ganz gerne Martin Saar noch einmal vielleicht darauf antworten lassen und dann, wir haben endlos länger gesprochen, als ich gedacht hatte, dann würde ich diesen Teil des Gesprächs erstmal beenden und dann das Publikum gerne einladen.
This part of our discussion and then invite the audience to ask questions. Well, it's just a comment or a question to what has just been said. How realistic is it? The book that we've talked about 3 years ago was called Republic Haifa in English, to make it clear that this is a different kind of Israel than the one that we know with the capital of Tel Aviv. And the German publishing house that translated the book explicitly called the book Israel eine Utopie, or Israel a Utopia. So this made clear, and it's also mentioned in the book, that what Omri Boehm suggests is part of this tension and real politics and its options, and it's also been justified. And there are quite fascinating episodes in the book in which it's being said that the old tradition of the prophetic speech is nothing that is over yet, not even with the secularization of our political discussion, but there's room for those who speak and to remind us of the moral principles, even though it seems unrealistic at that point of time. And this is a mixture of demanding utopian, and Omri Boehm tries to fill this gap. So thank you very much, first of all.
Ja, ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank auch für Ihre Geduld, dass wir jetzt so lange gesprochen haben.
Thank you very much for your patience. We have gone way over time.